Social media is supposed to enhance your life. It's supposed to help you keep in touch with loved ones and reconnect with friends you haven't seen in years. Sadly, for some, that's not how it works. Far too often, social media is nothing more than a breeding ground for racists, homophobes, and the kind of people you generally wouldn't extinguish if they were on fire. Yet, for a vast majority of people, it is a necessary evil and one they would struggle to live without. Where there is struggle, there are always those who look to prey on these moments. Takahiro Shiraishi was one of these predators. Between August and October of 2017, he would etch himself into serial killer infamy. He was dubbed the Twitter Killer because he used social media to lure suicidal women to his home, where he drugged, robbed, raped, and killed them before dismembering their bodies. Thank you for joining me today. Please like and subscribe if you enjoy the content, and don't forget to leave a comment. The story takes us to Japan, a place near and dear to my heart. I first got acquainted with the Japanese culture in 2019, and it was one of the most humbling experiences of my life. When I landed at Chitose Airport, I asked for directions to the bus terminal, and a Japanese man literally escorted me to the bus terminal instead of giving me directions. I was so grateful. I had never experienced such willingness to help, and he didn't even work at the airport. And therefore, with his kindness, the first Japanese person I ever met in Japan had set a tone that will continue throughout my holiday. Japan has become a main tourist attraction in recent years due to its vibrant culture, connection to nature, and of course, food. And we can't talk about Japan without mentioning their iconic vending machines. You might associate vending machines with readily available cans of drinks and snacks like candy and chips. But in Japan, you can get cold and hot beverages, fresh fruit and vegetables, clothing, cigarettes, and even alcohol from their vending machines. On October the 9th, 1990, Takahiro Shiraishi was born. He grew up with his parents and younger sister in the city of Zama, central Japan. He was a quiet, inconspicuous boy who went to elementary and junior high schools in the city, where he played baseball and was on the track team. His grades were far from stellar, but he was an attentive student who didn't especially stand out, but was not a gloomy character either. He went to high school in the city of Yokohama, and around this time, his parents divorced, with his mother and sister moving out of the family home. For all intents and purposes, Takahiro was your normal, average 20-year-old. He was cheerful, kind, polite, hardworking, and very close to his family, particularly his father. In fact, a neighbour reported that Takahiro's father would always speak of his son in glowing terms and always look forward to them going for drinks together. But the warning signs were perhaps there, as Takahiro and his friends enjoyed choking each other for fun. In one case, he even passed out completely. After graduating from senior high in 2009, he did a series of odd jobs, including working in a supermarket and food factory, before starting his criminal trajectory in Tokyo, where he started working as a scout for a seedy prostitution ring. His role consisted of convincing women to work as prostitutes in the biggest red light district of Kabukicho, Tokyo. To do this, he would lure them into the nightclubs there, and use his charm to persuade them to turn tricks for a living. A scout's job doesn't end when he brings a girl to a club. He's like a manager and consultant, negotiating her treatment and giving guidance on getting money from clients to support herself. This relationship continues until she leaves the business. Girls nowadays tend to be in it for what they can get, and are always thinking about moving to a better club. So they trust scouts more than the people where they work. Being able to convince someone to sell their body for money can't be an easy thing to do. After all, you're giving yourself up to be nothing more than an object. So for Takahiro to be successful enough within the industry that he could make a decent living out of it, he must have been born with a silver tongue in his mouth. This would later prove to be a talent he would use for his own twisted pleasure. But at this point, his career as a sex scout was fruitful, yet ultimately flawed. He was arrested in February 2017 for pimping out girls to the local brothels and was sentenced to a 14-month prison term. Unfortunately, this was suspended for 3 years, and if it hadn't been, then what followed would never have taken place. Takahiro moved back to Zama into a one-room apartment on August 22, 2017. Finding himself unemployed, Takahiro did what most people in his circumstance would do and spent most of his day on the internet. This is where the story takes a sinister turn, as he starts the hunt for 8 of the 9 poor souls who would become his victims. During his time in the sex industry, he'd used Twitter as a platform to coerce young girls into working the nightclubs for him. But now he would change tact and start preying on people who were at the end of their tether. He used a Twitter profile called Hanging Pro, which featured a comic drawing showing a man whose neck and wrists are scarred and who is wearing a rope around his neck alongside a bio that said, "I want to help people who are really in pain. Please DM me anytime." He put out an advertisement on this Twitter handle, asking people to come to his house so he could watch them commit suicide. He tweeted statements such as, "It is not hard to hang oneself," and "If you cannot help yourself, I can help you." He promised these vulnerable people that he would help them take their own lives, and sometimes even go as far as to say that he would kill himself with them. He often expressed a desire to die to connect with his victims on a deeper level and win their trust. Sadly, this was a lie. Takahiro's operation had a distinct pattern. He looked through hashtags like suicide recruitment, message women that voiced their desires to die, and lure them to his house under the pretense of helping them perish together. He won women's trust by acting sympathetic to their unfortunate situation, by which point he would toy with their feelings with their sweet nothings to reel them in. In 3 months, he took the lives of 9 people, but it wasn't until the brother of one of the victims went out of his way to search for his missing sister that Takahiro's crimes would come to light. Obviously concerned that his sibling had seemingly vanished off the face of the earth, the young man started his own investigation. It wasn't long before he found that she had posted a message on Twitter looking for someone to join her in a suicide pact. Understandably horrified by what he was reading, the victim's brother hacked into his sister's Twitter account where he discovered the conversations between his sister and Takahiro. He struck up a conversation with him, pretending to be another lost soul looking for an escape, and arranged a rendezvous. He then enlisted the help of a female friend who claimed to almost fall into Takahiro's trap herself, before contacting the police to set up a sting operation. On October 31st, 2017, they agreed to meet at a train station near his home, but when he returned back to his apartment, officers were waiting there instead. They raided Takahiro's flat and couldn't believe what they found. It was a grisly discovery. Like a true sociopath, he had 9 heads along with various limbs and 240 bones as trophies stashed away in coolers and toolboxes around his home. Neighbours corroborated the events by confirming that foul smells of rotting flesh had come from the house. Takahiro had discarded elements of the people into his bin, which had been taken away in the recycled rubbish, then sprinkled cat litter over the remains in an effort to cover up the evidence. 8 of his 9 victims were women in their late teens to early 20s, some as young as 15. The 9 victims originally had their identities revealed to the press, but an active gag order was issued to protect their anonymity. In the face of such overwhelming evidence against him, he simply confessed. He explained via Twitter that he wanted to use his victims' vulnerable states to manipulate and sexually assault them, fulfilling his fantasies and not having to worry about them denying his advances. He then proceeded to rape them before strangling them to death. The only one of the 9 who wasn't a victim of this terrible plan was the boyfriend of the first person he killed. When he went to speak to Takahiro after she had gone missing, he suffered the same fate as the others. Takahiro then explains how he hacked the bodies up and threw chunks of flesh out with the garbage. This would explain why, as it was reported by someone living in the block of flats, he had the extractor fan running 24 hours a day. The case stunned Japan, as did the matter-of-fact way that Takahiro relayed details of his crimes to the police. He was cold, calculating, and seemed to show zero remorse for his actions. This went against him at his trial. The judge said, "None of the 9 victims consented to be killed, including by silent consent. It is extremely grave that the lives of 9 young people were taken away. The dignity of the victims was trampled upon. All the murders were well planned, and the method makes it one of the most malicious murders ever in the history of crime. It caused massive shock and anxiety to a society where the use of social media is commonplace. Takahiro, who wore black-rimmed glasses and a white mask, was stone-faced and emotionless during the 80 minutes it took the judge to read the entire judgment, ultimately resulting in Takahiro being sentenced to death. Executions in Japan are relatively rare, though it remains one of the few developed countries that still enforces the death penalty. Takahiro was visibly shaken during the trial when a message from his mother was read out in court. "I've been asking myself if I could even live, thinking of the victims and their bereaved families." Throughout the trial, he defied his own attorneys by refusing to answer their questions, hoping to end the process faster so he wouldn't inconvenience his relatives. Addressing his family, he said, "I don't think it's possible, but I want you to forget about my existence and live on." Whenever a news story of this magnitude breaks, it always boggles the mind. I have no idea how one human being can treat another as a piece of meat, yet this is what Takahiro did. There is a possibility that his arrest for soliciting women into prostitution was a catalyst for his descent into madness. After all, it was only when he could no longer work as a scout for the sex industry did this killing spree take form, and he is alleged to have told his father in June, 1 month before he set off on his murderous rampage, "There is no meaning in life. I do not know what I am living for." But there is more than enough evidence to suggest that Takahiro was just looking for an excuse to become a serial killer. For a start, there is a game that he was more than eager to participate when he was younger. And as I said earlier in this video, that should have been more than enough for those who knew him to start to have suspicions that not everything was as it seemed to be with their friend. There is also the fact that he was quite eager to join an industry where he could use his cunning and charm to turn women out for money. These are all the hallmarks of a sociopath. And if, as I suspect, that's what Takahiro is, then it was only a matter of time before he set about acting out his fantasies. Even more worrying, at least, is how easy it was for him to find his victims through social media. The way he could seek out women between the ages of 15 to 26 who were obviously at the lowest points of their lives fills me with utter disgust and simply at a loss for words. I also think it falls to the companies who run these sites to be far more vigilant in how their product is used. It always seems as if it takes something to happen that is media-worthy for those in power to crack down on specific behaviours, and it really shouldn't be this way. They need to have contingency plans in place to be able to reach out and help those who are literally crying out for it. Until they do, I fear that Takahiro won't be the last person to troll these places looking for people to exploit. Twitter CEO Jack Dorsey called the case extremely sad and said the social media company needed to ensure its site is being used in positive and healthy ways. It also prompted Twitter to introduce new rules and regulations regarding suicide and self-harm. Japan has the highest rate of suicide in the developed world. The number of suicides had fallen sharply in the past decade, but shot back up in 2020, especially among young women, which experts believe to be linked to the coronavirus pandemic. Despite expanded support in recent years, suicide hotlines in Japan are often overwhelmed with calls. Jiro Ito, the head of OVA, a non-profit trying to prevent suicide, said the case showed that vulnerable people sometimes seek help by tweeting suicidal thoughts. The fundamental issue reflected in this case is that there are people who cannot ask for help in person, in the real world. That's because they feel so lonely or are in too much pain to do that, so they turn to the internet to express their feelings. While technology and the internet brought desirable changes to the world, they also unearthed the dark, rotten underbelly of social media anonymity. Faceless strangers that lurk around every corner of the internet, preying upon hapless, vulnerable people, exploiting their insecurities, have been given access to the world by means of the internet. The unfortunate victims of Takahiro Shiraishi got their justice. But was it too little and too late?